An incredible journey already that is continuing to unfold. So he has been in the New Thought and Human Potential movement, working in that field for over 30 years. He is the senior minister at Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta with a large and thriving congregation. He's a relentless social justice and global service activist. He founded a nonprofit called Kaleidoscope Child Foundation that creates ongoing fresh water well projects in the Siem Reap area of Cambodia. He also founded 2 schools there, which provide free education and medical support to nearly 500 children and young adults. The schools are doing so well that he's now looking to start another one in the Bihar region of India. David's also an adventurer, like our Reverend Karen. He's hiked the Camino. He has also climbed Kilimanjaro in Africa, Machu Picchu, and trails throughout the Andes. He is a gifted and very active teacher, writer, and columnist with 2 best-selling books that you're encouraged to check out. Where Regret Cannot Find Me and The Grass is Greener Right Here. And he is selling those in the lobby following the service. And so we are incredibly blessed. And would you please join me in welcoming Reverend David Alt.
Good morning, good morning. A community that has a dance break and ninjas with sabers. That's my kind of community, so I'm really excited to be here. I've been involved in this, as was said, for many, many decades, and I actually got my start by this woman. You may have heard of her. Her name is Louise Hay. Back in the early days, before her first book became a big bestseller, she was hosting these events in the Los Angeles area, and a friend of mine was running sound for her, and he came up to me and he said, Louise is looking for music to support her message. And so we collaborated and formed a trio, and shortly after that, Louise sort of hit it big and graciously took us with her on the road for many years, where I got a crash course in New Thought and all of the things that are accompanied by that. And it opened up a whole different world for me. And I am forever blessed by her. She will turn 91 this year. And so we had a big birthday party for her in San Diego last October, and it's just amazing to see her continue to thrive. So she is my role model. She has been my mentor and the love of my heart for many, many years, and I am so eternally blessed to have been exposed and introduced into this amazing teaching in that way. So that opened up for me a whole different realm of thinking. Probably like you, maybe Ireland might be the only exception in this room. I did not grow up in New Thought. I grew up in First Assemblies of God in Beaumont, Texas. Praise God, hallelujah. And as soon as I could get out, I tried to get out. And I thought that I would get out immediately after high school, only to, and I came from very minimal means, and so I worked really hard to get a scholarship. And I loved journalism, so I thought that that would be my path. And I remember the day that I unfurled the acceptance letter that I had gotten a full scholarship, and my mother said this, son, I was born in Texas, son, the Lord told me. Now, if your mom starts a sentence with the Lord told me, there's very little room for argument. And in my swift 17-year-old mind, I thought, okay, how do I get out of this? And I made a deal with her. I said, I'll tell you what. She finished it by saying, the Lord told me that you are to go to Oral Roberts University, which for me meant prison for another 4 years. So in my way to try to calculate and move out of that, I said, I'll tell you what, I will apply for a scholarship. And if I get it, we will know that it was actually the Lord's voice that you heard. And I felt myself pretty assured and crafty in all of that, because I believe that was around June, and the academic year started in August, and how many scholarships could possibly be left in that short window of time? And that will teach you to be specific, because it was a partial scholarship. So not only did I get that partial scholarship, but I gave up my journalism aspirations, and off I went to the same old thing. And maybe in New Thought you've heard this term before, divine discontent. And divine discontent is actually a great thing. It's the precursor for change. So all of us need to arrive at the precipice of divine discontent and actually embrace it and welcome it. And because what it's saying is that what is tried and true right now we have outgrown, that there's something stale about that, and it's time to move into new arenas, and we get to trust and activate all those delicious things like faith. And so going there was not anything different. But I will tell you, after 4 more years of that, the divine discontent was like a geyser that was just gushing out of my forehead and my heart and everything else. And I moved to New York City, and declared that I never wanted to have anything to do with God ever again. And I'm a minister. So, but I look back at that era of growing up in Beaumont, Texas, and part of my survival instinct was that I would climb trees and I would read books. And I would just stay in the trees because there was much abuse happening down on the ground. And so that was my safe haven. And then when I would read these stories about Harriet Tubman and Abner Doubleday and Walt Disney and George Washington Carver and all of these autobiographies for young readers, I began to see a theme. And the theme was obstacles and continuing to move forward in spite of obstacles. And I began to self-identify with these stories. So sitting up in this tree in my little postage stamp front yard in Beaumont, Texas, I began to have this recurring sense of, if they can do it, why can't I? And so why not me? And thus began to cultivate this imaginary sense of adventure. And I swore to myself that when I was on my own, that adventure would be a part of my life. I didn't know how I would pay for it. I didn't know what that would look like. But now today, what I call that is a value. Adventure is a value for me. And somewhere in the late 90s, I was reading an article by a travel writer. I believe his name was Doug Boyd. And he said this: the most powerful affirmation or mantra that one can speak is, I'm available. And he said, look out. Because if you're sincere about that, your whole world will start to change. And something about that really ignited that spark of adventure within me. And at the same time, I also started to understand the importance and the necessity for understanding what a value system was. For me, understanding what values are and incorporating that has become a mainstay in my spirituality. What do I mean by that? I believe that the universe, this place that we are a part of in our humanity and our divinity, is very intentional. And so, to the degree that I half-heartedly do something is the degree in which I half-heartedly get back a return. And if I'm very vague about what is important to me or what my values are, then I'm always in this sense of density and vagueness with regards to the way in which I do life. But if I take a moment and I pause and I say, what are my values? And I look at those things and I begin to craft my yes and my no around those values, then my intentionality and my specificity rises, and thus the reciprocity of that energy begins to present itself to me. So I went back to this travel writer's quote of, I'm available. And I started to ask, what is important to me? What are my values? Adventure, since the time in the tree, was that. And I began to decide that things like health, because if you don't have your health, how are any of these other values going to work out for you? I decided that adventure was there. I decided that spirituality and self-awareness were a value. And I began to write them down, and I would look at the word on the physical piece of paper and go, I'm available. I'm available. And I would breathe into this intentionality into these values, and I'd kind of go, okay, what's going to happen? And at the same time, I was moving and activating and doing what I thought was my work to do. But with adventure, what began to happen was that through my work with Louise and in traveling in New Thought churches and speaking and teaching and performing over 30 years, I had developed a nice little email list. And I began to see that I could take people on sacred site journeys, and if I got enough people to come along, then my expenses would be paid. So here's this little boy from Southeast Texas that had nothing, that suddenly is finding a vehicle for adventure to be able to see the world. And in the early 2000s, one of those trips was to Thailand and Cambodia. I had had no personal affinity for that part of the world before, but here was this trip that was available to me. And I began to study up, particularly on Cambodia, and realized that the largest spiritual temple complex in the world is in Cambodia. It's called Angkor Wat. Maybe some of you have been there. It's just truly magnificent. And when we first went to Thailand, and it was beautiful and wonderful, we were having a great time, but something shifted when we landed in Cambodia. And maybe this has happened to you before. Have you ever entered into a place and you instantly had an affinity for that place? It was as if some old lifetime was rearing its head and saying, "Welcome home." And that was exactly what happened when our plane landed in Siem Reap. And we got off into the hot, humid air, and I could just feel this sensation. And back then, there was still rampant poverty that was deeply exposed. And so the people who were traveling with me could not help but see the delineation between the haves and the have-nots. The haves being the tourists and the have-nots being these local people. And there's that natural empathic part of us that wants to do something. And so as we were traveling through Cambodia, the group kept saying, we should do something, we should do something. And that had always happened before, and I would manage those requests, but something felt different about this particular place. So I went to our guide and I said, I have 16 people and they want to do something. I said, but here's what I'm looking for. I want you to take us to the worst possible situation that you know. And he looked at me kind of strangely and he said, why? And I said, I don't know. I just feel like it's imperative that you take us to this kind of experience so all of us can see what it is that is going on here in the reality of this country. And so he thought about it for a moment and he said, I'm going to take you to the Tonle Sap. The Tonle Sap is the largest waterway in that particular part of Asia. And in the dry season, what happens is as the water recedes, all of the transients, all of the refugees, all of the landmine victims, everyone that is displaced, all of the orphaned children and those who are starving, congregate on these dry riverbanks of the Tonle Sap. And he said, if you really want to see it, if you really want to do something, I would say feed these children. And I said, how do we do that? And he said, well, you can't just feed them anything. You're going to have to find things that are indigenous to their digestive system and then find a way to transport whatever it is that you purchase to that location. And he said, you can't just show up because it'll be a mob scene. So we're going to have to talk about the logistics of all of this. And as we worked it out and as I went back to the group and I told them about the opportunity and they said, yes, 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 we went to the local markets that are run by the Cambodian families. And we started to purchase all of the things that we thought were appropriate for their needs. And when all was said and done, we had wiped out 3 local markets worth of food. So these markets, these individual placements are run by these families. And so we had bought 3 families out entirely and got a fleet of vans and we loaded all of this stuff in. And our guide, I still don't know how he did this because this was in the days before cell phones were rampant. He got a message to the matriarch of this transient village. Yes, even a transient village has a matriarch. And he let them know that we were coming. And when I went to pay for the food, for all of these 3 markets worth of food, it cost $86. And it was that moment. It was that moment that I thought, wow, even I could do something on a sustainable basis. I have no idea what that would look like, but this is doable. And I just kept that image in my head about this is doable. I'm available, I'm available, I'm available. And so as we got there and began to unload, it was remarkable because there were about 100 children that were sitting uniformed in the dirt in these lines waiting. And for about 9 minutes, it was very organized. And then off in the distance, you started to hear the sort of rumble, ground shaking, and a stampede, I kid you not, a stampede of more children started running because they had heard that there was food. And the next thing that I knew is that we were surrounded and being grabbed at, and all of the goods and were being flung out of our hands and distributed in a very chaotic manner. And then all of a sudden, boom, it was done. And we all stood there, and we were sort of breathing very heavily. And one woman looked down, and she noticed that all of our clothes had these little muddy handprints all over them. And she said, "Oh my God, I'm never gonna wash this. This is the canvas of humanity." And we stood there, and then something physiological began to happen. Have you ever heard this phrase before, the ugly cry? I could feel the ugly cry about to happen. And I felt like, oh my God, I'm the leader. I have to have a sense of decorum, and I have to put it all together. And yet I could actually feel as though my heart had burst open. And this deep well of emotion that felt old, it felt massive, it felt aged, started to well up within me. And I began to look around for a place to escape on the dirty, smelly banks of the Tonle Sap. And there was nothing but an old pontoon boat that was sitting tied up. I crawled on my hands and knees into the back of that pontoon boat, and I began to wail. And it was a conscious release where I realized that I wasn't crying out of pity, but I was crying from that self-identification that those children were me and that I was them, and that somehow that same process of self-identification that I had done in that tree when I was a kid back in Texas was the same thing that was happening here, except at a much larger, grander scale. And I just began to weep. And I remember that quote, and I remember on my hands and knees going, I'm available. I'm available to this. And so I started to go back every year, and I had no plan, I had no systems. All that I knew was I had an idea that I wanted to give back. I wanted to find a way to serve. I wanted to be able to provide something to those children that I had lacked when I was that age. And I made a ton of mistakes. But year after year, I would show up, and I kept looking for someone to help me, someone to align with, some organization. And nothing seemed to follow through until one year, I did meet a local Cambodian man, and he said, I can teach you how to dig wells. And I said, okay. Because like most rural, poor countries, the water situation is horrific, and there's much disease that affects particularly the children. And he said, we can put these wells in through a rudimentary auger system and through using a generator, and if we strike water, this family can have fresh water in 24 hours or less. And we would test it. And so I started collecting money to dig these wells. And one time when we were down digging a well, I looked at him and I said, I've observed all of these children not in school. And I said, how much could it cost to build a school? It was very kind of Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, hey, let's put on a show. It's like, hey, let's build a school. And he said, well, you can't just do that. You're going to have to go through these formalities. You're going to have to go and file this paperwork and start an NGO. And I said, how hard could it be? And he marched me into the government offices of the People's Party of Cambodia, where basically that's what naivete looks like. I went, I want to build a school. And they were like, who are you working for? And I wanted to say, God, but I thought better of that. And I filled out this paperwork, and I was put in a holding cell for an entire day, not knowing why. They took all of my money. Later, what I realized is that because the sex trafficking is so horrific in that part of the country, they were trying their best with my passport to run background checks on me, and it was taking an entire day. But they never revealed that to me. And finally, when they let me go later that night, had taken all my money, had taken my application, there was nothing with regards to acknowledging what would happen after that. And so I went back the next year, again, not hearing anything, still looking for ways to create sustainability. And then in 2009, when I arrived that January, this person that I was working with picked me up on his scooter, and he says, I have a surprise for you. I said, what? And he drove me off to this little bar that had a rusted fan in the ceiling. It felt very Casablanca. And very ceremoniously, he pulled out this piece of paper and he said, congratulations, you have your school. 2 years had gone by. And he said, and I have another surprise for you. And I went, what? And he had taken what little money we had saved, and off of the grid, he had put up these little transient huts with thatched roofs, and we went there, and there were over 200 kids sitting and waiting, and he goes, here's your school. I'm available. Wow. And so global education became one of my values. And I kept whispering and saying, I'm available. And in the Course in Miracles, my favorite line in that whole work is this: love brings up everything unlike itself. And at first I used to go, what does that mean? Love brings up everything unlike itself. And I began to realize that if I stand in front of the world and I say, I am an advocate for love, then everything unlike love rises up, not to test me per se, but to help me make good on my proclamation. So if you say, I am an advocate for peace, then everything unlike peace rises up in order for us to make good on that intention. And I have discovered the same principle follows with these values. That if I say I'm available to this thing, I'm available for global education, then everything unlike that shows up in order to see whether or not I'm serious about that. And so there were a ton of mistakes over the years, but it's wonderful to announce to you that after 14 years of all of that, that we have these amazing schools there in Cambodia that are campuses that teach life skills training, and we have computer technology, and the people are learning how to code. And our second school is actually in a village where some of the Cambodian women are actually learning how to code so that they can begin to create sustainability within themselves. And the board that I was fortunate enough to create through all of this looked at me on this last trip and they said, it feels like we're supposed to expand. And so last year I had traveled to India and I just said, I'm available, and if there's a place that we are supposed to replicate this, then it will be made known. That's a whole nother story, but it happened. And in January, we opened up a room where 90 Indian children are crammed in there to receive free education. And last week, I was in Guatemala doing the same thing. And we have decided that these will be our 3 stations right now where we begin to do our work. In your program, I gave you the quote by Eleanor Roosevelt that says, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. You know what my favorite word is in that quote? Must. Must. So I would venture to say that all of us in this room have declared that we are people on a spiritual path. And to be on this spiritual path is a path of intentionality. There's intention in that quote that says, the most powerful mantra in the world is, I'm available. It's very intentional. That Course in Miracles, love brings up everything unlike itself. It's very declarative and intentional. And Eleanor Roosevelt saying, you must do the thing you think you cannot do. It's very intentional. And it means that at some point on this path, you and I get to decide what our values are. Is your value self-love? Is your value education? Is your value health? What is it that means something to you? And rather than it being in a back burner existence, I'm telling you that our soul's purpose is not to leave it there, but to bring it to the forefront. Bring it to the forefront. What I've learned over these years as a minister is people don't want to hear a sermon anymore. They want to see a sermon. And so all of us are ministers. All of us are sharing the same platform of intentionality. And I will promise you that it's true, that if you declare and get specific on what's important to you, and you say, I'm available, you don't have to concern yourself with the how or the why. But that suddenly things begin to move. And your whole reason for being becomes clearer. And the path becomes known. Maybe not in its entirety, but piece by piece, as it is that we are needed, it shows up for us. And what I know is that that's what you and I are here to do. And I hope, beyond hope, and I pray beyond prayer, that my life and your life begin to ripple out and influence the rest of this world, because I do believe that you and I are here to reveal this world, this life that is working for all. And it's going to work through you and I when we become clear about what our values are. You must do that thing that you think you cannot do, so you can understand that, yes, I am capable of doing that. And so it is. Thank you so much.